I went to McDonald's, but a sign said the place is closed. I can't have a Big Mac, and I really wanted one of those. I went over to Starbucks to find something that I could do. The note in the window said they're shut because of bat flu. So I drove over to Tesco, but the shelves were nearly empty. The vegan chickpea vindaloo was not enough to tempt me. I phoned up the police and I said, when will this lockdown end? They said, we will not let you out till you've gone round the bend. I called up the Brooklyn fragrance lover in New York. He said it's the same here, you can't even take a walk. You can't have a barbecue, a picnic or a party unless you want to end up like Linda Lusardi. The whole situation now is getting really sinister. The latest one to go sick is the British Prime Minister. He's working from home so he can keep the British people free, but we really need to know when we can go and get a KFC. Hello everyone, welcome back to all of you in the Smelly Army. So it's lockdown time across the world. Not even getting dressed today, I'm in my dressing gown, and that's not going to stop me making fragrance videos, of course. So today we're going to do another one in my series in all-time classic fragrances. I did Terre d'Hermès last week. I was saying I'll do them as unedited videos back then, but I've thrown in an intro and a bit that you can see me at the beginning, and then we're going to flip to the POV style and tell you all about today's fragrance, Jean Paul Gaultier Le Mal. Let's get stuck into it. Okay, so here we go. Let's have a look at it. So Jean Paul Gaultier Le Mal, first released in 1995. I should tell you before we get started, I know a lot of people will talk about which year and the vintage and the reformulations. Mine is an old vintage bottle, a BPI made in France version. I don't think it's mid-90s or anything, but it's quite a few years old. It was kindly lent in by Claire from the Smurfy Girly channel, who is the owner of this 125ml bottle. So I'm not sure the era, but it's quite a few years old. It is vintage, and we'll talk about the differences between the different eras and maybe a bit later. So before we get into the rest of the information about the fragrance itself, as I'm doing in these all-time classic videos, I'm going to give a bit more information about the house, the fragrance stroke fashion house itself of Jean Paul Gaultier. So Jean Paul Gaultier himself, born in 1952 in the Bagneux region of Paris, or one of the suburbs of Paris, a very, very famous fashion designer, actually, of course, from France. He has actually in 2020, I believe it as recently as February, announced that he will be retiring from the runway, as they call it, very soon. I don't think that means he'll be completely retiring from the fashion world, but he's not going to be doing collections anymore in the way that he has been doing. So by 1976, the young Jean Paul Gaultier had his first individual collection released as a fashion designer, and in 1982 he founded the now well-known, world-famous fashion house of Jean Paul Gaultier. Very much a modern brand of its in the time, in the 80s and 90s, which was a little bit maybe irreverent, which had a reputation for a kind of cheeky style, and indeed Jean Paul Gaultier himself therefore was known as the enfant terrible of the French fashion industry. In 1985, for example, he introduced the man skirt, the kind of kilt that he often was seen wearing in his prime, and so an example of the kind of slightly untraditional way he had of approaching fashion design. Also, if you're in the UK, you'll probably remember that, or if you're old enough, that between 1993 and 97, he famously hosted the TV series Eurotrash alongside Antoine de Caunes, which was a cheeky, irreverent look at European popular culture in general, and was quite an amusing program, and a lot of us got to know him as a person, as a character, a little bit through that program. Into the fragrance stuff then. The first release from the fashion house of Jean Paul Gaultier was 1993's Classique, a female fragrance, a floral oriental fragrance, which has a bottle similar to that of Le Mal, as you can see there. And along came in 1995 the first male fragrance release from the house, Le Mal. In those days, we didn't have tons and tons of fragrances from all fashion houses coming out all the time. They'd been going since 1982. Only in 1995 did they release their first fragrance for men, and Le Male was it. And then we didn't have tons of flankers coming out immediately after that. It was quite a long time before the first flankers appeared, and that whole thing has really exploded in the 21st century. You may be aware of the many flankers to Le Male. There's Fleur de Mal La Cologne, Le Beau Mal, La Mal Eau Fraiche, Essence de Parfum, Ultra Mal, one of the famous ones from 2015. A hugely successful line commercially, but we're talking about the classic original eau de toilette today. So let's get stuck in to the information about the actual fragrance itself. The perfumer for this one, Francis Kurkdjian. This was his first big fragrance release. I think the first fragrance he actually made that was commercially released. I may be wrong about that, but certainly the first big one that hit home and was successful. So he was an unknown perfumer, and he was only born back in 1969, which at the time would have made him a rather young man. Very, very famous perfumer for those of us into the world of fragrances now. By 2009, he founded his own range, his own brand, the Maison Francis Kurkdjian, of which there is a niche brand, rather highly priced, and perhaps one of the most famous ones is Baccarat Rouge 540. Many other big popular releases, Masculine Pluriel. I could go on endlessly about that range, but let's talk about Le Male. So he composed this one. It was released in 1995. It's defined as an Oriental fougere scent. You can buy it relatively inexpensively in shops now. It's not the most expensive fragrance out there. However, it has received numerous reformulations. Most people agree the smell is roughly the same now, but the performance is not as good as it used to be. On this old bottle I've got, it's something of a beast mode style fragrance. So rightly regarded as one of the all-time classic fragrances, it's one of those ones you can instantly recognize, or many of us can, when we smell it on somebody. Even if you're not into fragrances, a lot of people can smell, oh, you're wearing Le Male, if somebody does. In the top, we've got mint, bergamot, cardamom, and artemisia. In the mid, cinnamon, cumin, orange blossom, and lavender. Base notes of vanilla, tonka bean, sandalwood, cedar, and amber. So this is a beautiful, wonderfully creamy, slightly sweet, rather lavender-centric fragrance that is really remarkable, and it was quite unlike anything that had been smelled before it when it first came out. It does have this notable little note of mint in there. The bergamot you won't pick up on. Certainly the cardamom and artemisia, which is sometimes also known as wormwood, are very much noticeable to me. They give this kind of creamy, very almost milky kind of feel to the fragrance. There is a sweetness about it. Definitely vanilla is a big player in this fragrance, as is the tonka bean, and I would certainly pick up on lavender. So some people call this a barbershop fragrance. I would perhaps say it's a sort of a neo barbershop fragrance. It has that classic kind of lavender feel that many of the old barbershop classics have, but it's taken it in a really new direction, and I think it ushered in an era of fragrances like this, or certainly some fragrances which were influenced by it, which came along later. For example, things like Dolce & Gabbana's By Man from 1997. In the niche world, in the 21st century, we have Invasion Barbar from MDCI Parfums, and Histoire de Parfum 17 Casanova, I think, have a little bit of this barbershop lavender feel mixed with sweetness, perhaps a hint of anise or licorice, which I think might even be there in this one, Jean Paul Gaultier's Le Male. So it's creamy, it's rather sweet. To me, I get a suggestion of floral notes in here. There is orange blossom, but I think there may be other floral notes in there as well. A lot of other people mention that they pick up more heavily on the cinnamon than I do, but I mainly get a slightly synthetic overall feel. Not massive development in the scent on skin. It smells to me very similar when you first spray it to how it does a few hours later. On the vintage bottle, great longevity, and it's got this kind of dandyish, it's not a very macho smell. It's not a macho, manly, hairy chest type of fougere. It's very much an oriental fougere. I think at the time it would have been for a man a little bit more in touch with his feminine side, in inverted commas, metrosexual type fragrance at the time. Very, very popular, has been worn by all kinds of different people, ages, walks of life. I think it was big in the clubbing scene. I was never a clubber. I know it had a bit of a following
going in the gay community. It was a kind of almost a cliche that gay guys out in the clubs would wear this. But at the same time, many heterosexual men were very much getting good compliments, apparently, from ladies with this one. Acqua di Gio and La Mal may be two of the classics of the mid-90s. Acqua di Gio could be your freshie, La Mal maybe your nights out and clubbing type fragrance. So an all-time classic for sure. If you want something that smells a little bit similar to this one, so if you want a cheap version, Milton Lloyd's Bondage is very similar to vintage La Mal, and it does last very well. Just a little bit more rough around the edges, arguably in scent. And for a more expensive niche, maybe refined version, Profumum Roma's Antico Caruso is very similar to my nose, but maybe just that little bit refined, that little bit less synthetic smelling. It's, of course, important to talk about the design of the bottle. This classic torso shape, very, very instantly recognisable, and a great piece of design. Not a very classic, or even, I mean, it could be regarded as slightly tacky, but you've got to hand it to them. It's instantly recognisable, iconic even, I would use that word. So for me, definitely an all-time classic fragrance. I don't wear it often. I had a bottle once when I was about 20-something, in my early 20s, that my mum gave me for Christmas, and it actually wasn't really my thing. Coming back to it now, as someone who's much more heavily into fragrances, I really think that I really respect this fragrance. I think it's a magnificent composition. It's probably not going to ever be my signature scent or one that I wear all the time, but I actually do now want to get my own vintage bottle of La Mal as a collector. It's a total unique classic. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments down below. Thanks ever so much for joining me. I'll see you in the next video. Remember, whatever you're doing in life, let's project. Bye-bye. Smelly, Smelly, Smelly.